Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Thanks, everybody. Thank you for bearing with us through this YouTube disaster that we're dealing with. So I know many of you are listening live, and then we will be releasing this as soon as possible. But, you make do. And joining us now is Glenn Greenwald. He's the co-founder of the Intercept, journalist. Sure you know who he is. He's also the co-author of this massive story that we're going to be talking about today. Glenn, thanks so much for being back.
It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me back.
So, Glenn, obviously, that I've sort of taken to this story in terms of Lula's imprisonment. I've always seen him as a political prisoner. I think there was a lot of reasons just sort of analytically to see potential U.S. influence there, the dynamics in Brazil, and also I think you and I in some ways, might have some interesting disagreements about Lula and PT, but recognized also that Lula really is a distinctly sort of important progressive political communicator in modern politics. So there was this many potential international dimensions to it. But this report really sort of fills in a lot of detail on the speculation that this Lava Jato team were, not clean players, to say the least. Can you center us first by saying what these leaks are, where they came from, and what, I guess, basically the main takeaways are before we go into different parts of the detail?
Sure. So Brazil, of course, is undoubtedly, your audience knows, has been through huge numbers of political crises, including the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff in 2016 and the ascension of Jair Bolsonaro, a previously unthinkably extremist figure, in 2018. Corruption scandals, political scandals, economic crises, epidemic of violence. But by far the biggest event and the most important event was the imprisonment of former President Lula da Silva in 2018, in part because he is one of the gigantic figures on the world stage when it comes to world leaders. He was elected overwhelmingly in 2002 and 2006 and left office with a 87% approval rating, brought millions of people out of poverty, transformed Brazil into a country of the future for the first time. I mean, it's hard to find somebody that surpasses his stature. So imprisoning him just for that reason alone is already an earth-shattering event. But it was so much more important because he was planning to run, and in fact was running again for president in 2018. He was term limited out of office in 2010. And all polls showed for a full year that he was not just the front runner, but the overwhelming favorite to win the election. And so you have this task force of prosecutors in Brazil called Lava Jato. In English, it means car wash, led by this judge, Sergio Moro, who have been putting huge numbers of people in prison with the clear goal of trying to get ultimately to Lula. And they prosecuted him in a very dubious way. You and I have talked about this before. I'm sure you've talked about this with other people. And that prosecution of him, that conviction of him by Judge Moro in 2018, once it was affirmed by an appellate court with remarkable and bizarre speed, meant that Lula was ineligible to run for president. So it not only put one of the most important world leaders in prison, but it took the front runner, the overwhelming favorite to be the next president, out of the running. It rendered him ineligible to run under the law, which paved the way for Bolsonaro's victory. And then as soon as Bolsonaro won, he turned around and rewarded the judge who convicted Lula, Sergio Moro, by creating this new super justice ministry position where Sergio Moro, has unparalleled powers. And it was an obvious, at least the perception was a quid pro quo. What makes the leak so significant, the archive that was provided to us by our source, is that there have been all kinds of leaks used by the prosecutorial task force in Judge Moro. They constantly leaked to the press accusations that were unverifiable and instantly destroyed the reputation of whoever reputation they wanted to destroy by leaking to Globo that so-and-so was accused of stealing or receiving a bribe. But there was almost no reporting about the prosecutors and the judge themselves. What were they doing? What were they saying internally? What were they plotting? The media turned them into these kind of deity figures, these superheroes that couldn't be questioned. And the archive that our source provided is this gigantic archive of all of their internal discussions, all of their internal emails and audios and videos and documents that enable us for the first time to take a look at what they were doing during the time that they were essentially radically transforming Brazil using the force of law.
So right, and so and again, just and to reiterate, right? So the sort of the perspective that PT has put forward and Lula has put forward, and I've echoed and have made disseminated, and I would say another site in addition to the reporting that you and the Intercept have done all along. There's an excellent independent site called Brazil Wire.
Yeah, Brazil Wire. Yeah,
the Indispensable and Brian Mara, which we've relied on a lot, who've always sort of like. Again, as I said, just analytically, you can put together what was on the public record, which are these enormously questionable things. Now, what has Lava Jato's public stance been in terms of their lack of a political bias? And first, let's talk about the team's specific reaction after they had already jailed Lula and removed him from the race. So these radical steps already taken. We'll get to that and what those charges were, what they were saying about that in private context, but them attempting to block him from even getting an interview, which of course he did not get, would seem to run in the face of their kind of public protest, public protests that they're non-biased sources. So what happened with Lula getting access to an interview in the last stages of the last year's presidential campaign?
Well, so this was, always the remarkable thing is that not only was Lula put into prison, but he was basically held incommunicado. So Lula is, I've interviewed him twice now, and there's just nobody who is a more charismatic communicator than he is. I mean, you go into an interview with him ready to challenge him, and within 2 minutes you feel hypnotized. Like you have to remind yourself you're not there to like him, you're there to question him. He has this like magnetism and charisma that I don't really think I've ever seen any other political leader possess. And so they obviously were, the elites of Brazil and the center and the center right have been trying for 16 years to defeat PT on the ballot box, and they just got crushed over and over because of the singular force of Lula. So they were petrified that if he was allowed to speak to the public in prison in the form of an interview, that he could single-handedly sway the election to PT. They thought this was their big chance to get rid of PT once and for all, right? They couldn't do it 4 times in a row. They lost 4 elections to PT, twice to Lula, twice to Dilma. They impeached Dilma. They finally got PT out of power. So this is going to be the first election since taking Dilma out of power, and they were petrified that all of those efforts were going to go to naught because Lula was just going to waltz back into the presidency. And so, or once Lula was imprisoned and rendered ineligible, that his chosen successor, who was Fernando Haddad, a kind of young, technocratic, one-term mayor of São Paulo, the one who Lula decided should be the PT candidate once Lula was rendered eligible, that Lula would have the power to basically cause Haddad to win the election by just communicating in the way that he communicates. So several media outlets, Folha of São Paulo, which is the largest newspaper in the country, but also the Intercept Brazil and me personally, spent 2018 petitioning the court to be able to interview Lula so that the public could hear from the former president about politics, about the 2018 race, about Bolsonaro, about Haddad. And it wasn't Lula asking for it because prisoners don't have a right to be interviewed. It was us, the press, asking for it on the ground that the right of the free press guarantees us the right to have access to him. And finally, about 2 weeks before the election, a particular member of the Supreme Court who's renowned for kind of being a courageous dissenter, granted the petition of Folha and one of the most influential journalists in the country who's great, Monica Bergamo, the right to interview Lula in prison. And they were all ready to do it. And what our leak show, our leak documents show, and it's one of the stories that we were able to report, is that immediately upon learning that a justice of the Supreme Court had authorized Lula to be interviewed by FOIA 12 days before the election, these supposedly apolitical, neutral, non-ideological prosecutors exploded in a rage and in a panic and spent all day plotting on how they could subvert or undermine or block the judicial order. They considered really unethical things like telling the federal police to purposely schedule it after the election and then claim that since there was no date in the order that they complied. They were thinking about themselves petitioning to allow every prisoner to be interviewed, so they would just turn it into a circus and dilute his interview. They were thinking about forcing other reporters in, so it was a press conference and not a one-on-one interview, which would further dilute it. It was all like they all looked like political operatives talking about how to dilute the political impact of Lula. But the most incriminating part was on several occasions, they openly admitted that their goal, that their motive in blocking the interview of Lula wasn't some sort of principled stance that prisoners shouldn't be interviewed, because, as the judge pointed out, the most dangerous prisoners in Brazil are routinely interviewed. The leaders of drug gangs, murderers, rapists. Their goal, they said, the fear that they had was that an interview with Lula, in their words, would help elect Haddad and would allow the return of PT to power. And the chief of the car wash task force, who has spent 5 years righteously insisting that he has no politics, he doesn't care about any party, he doesn't care about any ideology, he's only devoted to fighting corruption, said to one of his best friends, who's also a prosecutor, "Let us pray that today's events don't usher in the return of PT to power." So everything they've been denying for years, that people have been suspecting but couldn't prove, namely that they are vehemently opposed to PT on political grounds and have been using their prosecutorial powers in pursuit of that ideological agenda, was proven by the documents which we thus far have published.
You've just watched a Michael Brooks show video, and you can watch all of our full main live shows every Tuesday night at around 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and subscribe to get all of the clips you want. We're covering the globe. We're focusing on international relations, the intellectual dark web. We're having fun. We're doing deep dives with a lot of amazing guests. Of course, become a patron for the whole thing at patreon.com/TMBS, or subscribe to this YouTube channel and help us keep growing and get that content out there. Subscribe below.